Hi there, my name is Sarah Watson, and I chose to do the Salem witch trials, and I did it in the form of a research paper. The Salem witch trials took place in 1692 and 1693. My thesis for the entire research paper was due to the lack of solid evidence, Satan was merely a facade by which parsonage leaders gained control of the members of their church. They exploited the religious tension and fear, gender dynamics, and political upheaval of the time and sold it as demonic activity. In order to discern if any supernatural influences were involved, it's important to look at the evidence, or in most cases, the lack thereof. The reason I included that was because there really wasn't any actual solid evidence to prove that witchcraft was actually involved. So I think that was probably the most interesting part of this, was just to find out how ridiculously loose these court cases were. There was no like really solid evidence to prove anything. It was just a really wild time. This little background story of to why all of this happened is that in the Puritan community, um, there was little else to do or think of or interact with or anything that didn't have to do with God, or just Christianity in general. Um, Children or people were only taught to read so far as to be able to study the Bible. They had no other texts other than the Bible or religious ones. So the hope in teaching children to read was that they would only learn enough to then be able to study the Bible. That was the only purpose. Um, and kids were just not allowed to be typical children. They weren't really allowed to have any kind of imagination or have fun or play or any of that. Once a kid was old enough to start contributing to the family absolutely took advantage of that. Um, and it's kind of funny, in our textbook, it actually says that women were viewed as having weaker constitutions, which made them more susceptible to the devil. So women were definitely the ones who were mostly accused of witchcraft. I think there may have been like a few men, but for the most part it was women. So apparently women were just too weak to fight off the devil. Um, Jumping from sin to witchcraft was not a far jump because the supernatural is already pretty prevalent in their culture. They were very aware of, the otherworldliness out there. And the way that all of this got started was people were starting to complain of unusual illnesses. And anytime that they were spoken to about God, they would kind of start to freak out. Like if you've ever seen any of you know, um, the like Conjuring movies, or I can't think of what it's called, but the ones where, they do the, where they try to get the devil out of that girl or whatever, and they start freaking out. That's essentially what was happening. So if they were spoken to, it says if they were discoursed with about God or Christ or things of salvation, they were presently afflicted. And then if they were in the congregation at church, sometimes they would start having moments there as well. So that's pretty wild. Back to the evidence and the court cases. That was probably the biggest thing that really led me to believe that Satan had nothing to do with this. Their evidence was just so loosely based on some really ridiculous things. So, one of the most irrefutable parts of evidence was called spectral evidence. And essentially, what that means is that an individual afflicted by necromancy would therefore be capable of seeing a specter resembling the person who had bewitched him or her. So essentially, whoever was being accused of witchcraft would like appear as a vision to somebody else. And the reason that this was such irrefutable evidence to them was because they figured that God wouldn't allow the vision of somebody innocent to appear to someone. And so that was used a lot in these court cases where people would claim having visions of somebody. And so then that was like, all right, well, they're a witch because there's no way that you would see an innocent person. I have no idea how to even explain that. I mean, for all we know, it could have been hallucinations, or honestly, I think because the people knew that this was such irrefutable evidence, they could have just said it to make sure that that person was, fully convicted of being a witch, of doing witchcraft and being a witch. Um, in a lot of these cases, the reason that the person even got accused of witchcraft to begin with was due to some sort of conflict. In some cases, one of the people, her name was Elizabeth Howe, and she had told somebody, like one of her neighbors or something, that she hoped that his cow would choke, and then apparently, like within the day or next day or so, the cow choked on a turnip. And so obviously that was her. It had to be witchcraft. um so yeah, it just seems that, like, in a lot of these cases, what happened was that there was some sort of run-in with the witch, and the person didn't like it, and so they would accuse them of witchcraft, and they would use these, like, very loose evidence, uh, as convicting them. Another another thing that they would use for evidence was the ordeal of sight and touch. And so what would happen is the people that were convicting the witch would look at them, and when the witch would make eye contact with them, then the people would start freaking out. And so they said that using eye contact as a conduit for black magic. So essentially, in making eye contact with them, they were sending out their magic and afflicting these people, and so that's why they would start freaking out whenever they made eye contact. So again, there's really no way to solidify that and actually prove that it's real. The people could have known that was evidence, and as soon as the person looked at them, they could just start freaking out and convulsing or whatever. So yeah, there just wasn't a whole lot of, like, solid evidence to prove any of this. In another case, I believe her name was Martha Carrier. She had basically had an angry interaction, and as soon as they had this angry interaction, I don't really understand what it was about. The man had taken with a swelling in his foot, and then he experienced quite a few sores after that, which a doctor had lanced, and they kept coming back. And as soon as she was apprehended, he suddenly got better. To me, that just sounds like stress. Stress can do so many crazy things to your body. It just seems like, after they had whatever kind of run-in they had, maybe he was stressed about it, thinking like, oh no, she's a witch, she's going to hurt me. And so that stress caused him to have these physical ailments. And then as soon as he was no longer worried because she had been apprehended, then he starts healing. So it just seems kind of coincidental to me. And it seems that a lot of people who weren't directly involved in the Puritan culture, or even, didn't live there, didn't know anything about it, if they visited or had heard about it, so they came to see if they could help with the situation. A lot of people could kind of just see through it. They knew that there wasn't any, that none of this was real. We have a Thomas Brittle. He said, I cannot but condemn this method of justice, talking about the very inconsequential evidence. Those who'd not been steeped in Puritan religion practices and superstitions could see right through the guise of witchcraft. So, they saw it and they were absolutely confused, and they're like, this is not real. I don't know what you guys what you guys think is happening, but this is not witchcraft. Some people think that it had to do with the fact that they did not have a legally established government. So they were just kind of running themselves with, like, right and wrongs of the church. And so they really didn't have any sort of neutral entity that could come in between them and stop the witch trials. Also, some people think that it had to do with, like, gender issues, because 78% of the people accused were women. And so anytime a woman stepped out of her place, it had to be because she was afflicted with witchcraft. And another person who I don't really agree with thought that it had more to do with their the fact that they were already very familiar with the supernatural, um, saying that it had to do with folklore and magic, and their imaginations and stuff like that. But I don't really agree with that, because the fact that their children were squashed from having childhoods, that's usually when you start to develop your imagination and all that kind of stuff. And so, because they didn't have any books to read, they weren't allowed to act like children in any kind of capacity. They just really didn't. I don't believe that they could have developed their imaginations to be steeped in, that much like wonder and magic. So to conclude, um, when the Sir William Phipps, their first governor, when he came around and he finally ended all the mayhem, he actually referred to it as the dissolution of the devil. So that kind of even means to me that he really didn't believe that it had anything to do with witchcraft or the devil, because in Christianity, the devil's not an entity that can be dissolved or gotten rid of. And so the fact that he kind of thought that this was a temporary affliction, and that, in having a more strict government and laws and things, that now the people had kind of calmed down and they weren't acting out anymore, and that, the devil had been dissolved. So that even proves to me that he didn't believe in any of it. So yeah, to me, it was just the discrimination against women, against the lower class, and against those who were just simply irritating, and having no one with a neutral mindset to mediate were factors hidden beneath the disguise of witchcraft. So yeah, I don't believe that Satan had anything to do with it. I don't believe that there was any sort of supernatural things involved in this. I think it was just people without any kind of neutral guide. They went off of what they knew, and they kind of just went wild with it. So that's what I believe.